An abandoned baby is adopted by an old homeless woman. 20 years later, the parents came knocking on the billionaire's door. Hello, family. Welcome back. Please do well to subscribe, and let's know where you are watching the story from in the comment section. The wind in Chicago that night was sharp enough to cut through skin. It was late, the streets nearly empty, and snow kept falling in slow, heavy flakes that seemed to make the whole world quiet. The only sound was the crunch of boots on ice as Margaret Hayes made her way down the narrow alley behind Franklin's grocery. Her boots were falling apart. She had patched them with duct tape weeks ago, but the cold still seeped in. Each step felt like walking barefoot on ice. She pulled her thin coat tighter, but it didn't help much. The coat had once been beige, maybe 10 years ago. Now it was the color of dirt, with holes in the sleeves and a missing button near the collar. Margaret was 71 years old. Her back was bent, her hands were stiff from arthritis, and her hair, once black, was now a dull, wiry grey. She had been homeless for the last 8 years. She knew all the spots in the city where you could hide from the worst of the wind. Tonight, she was heading to her usual place, a little nook behind the grocery store dumpster, where the heat pipe sometimes let out a faint warmth. She walked slower than usual, her breath puffing out in front of her like little clouds. She kept her head down, eyes scanning the ground for anything. A dropped coin, a half-empty cup of coffee, anything at all. That's when she heard it. At first, she thought it was the wind making some strange whistling sound between the buildings. But then she froze. The sound came again. It wasn't the wind. It was crying. A baby's cry. Margaret's heart kicked in her chest. She followed the sound down the alley, moving as fast as her legs would allow. She turned a corner and there it was, an old, sagging cardboard box sitting in the snow. The crying was coming from inside. Her hands shook as she pulled back the soggy flap of cardboard. Inside, wrapped in a thin hospital blanket, was a newborn baby boy. His little face was red from the cold, his tiny fists waving in the air. "Oh, Lord have mercy," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. She looked around. The alley was empty. The snow-covered street beyond was quiet. No one was there. Whoever left this baby was long gone. Margaret carefully lifted the child from the box. He was so light, so small she could feel the bones beneath his skin. His little chest rose and fell in fast, shaky breaths. "It's all right, baby. It's all right now," she whispered, tucking him against her chest. Her own body wasn't much warmer than the air, but it was all she had to give. For a long moment, she just stood there, holding him and looking up at the falling snow. Her mind spun. She had nothing, no home, no money, no food, but she couldn't just leave him here. She had known hunger. She had known the kind of cold that makes you feel invisible. She had been abandoned once, too, and she swore she would never let anyone feel that way if she could help it. "You're not staying here, little one," she said firmly, as if the baby could understand. "Not while I'm breathing." Margaret hurried toward the only place she could think of, the old church shelter 2 blocks away. The snow crunched under her boots, and the wind bit her cheeks. But she clutched the baby close and kept walking. When she reached the shelter, she pushed open the heavy wooden door. Warm air and the smell of soup hit her all at once. The woman at the front desk, a young volunteer named Claire, looked up in surprise. "Margaret? What on earth?" She stood, eyes widening when she saw what Margaret was carrying. "Oh my God, is that—" "Yes," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "I found him in the alley. Someone left him there. Please, help him." Claire rushed forward and gently took the baby, wrapping him in a thicker blanket from behind the counter. "Come with me," Claire said quickly. She led Margaret into the main hall, where a few other volunteers sat with bowls of soup and cups of tea. Everyone's eyes went to the tiny bundle in Claire's arms. A middle-aged man named Pastor Jim stood up. "Dear Lord, who would do this?" "Someone with no soul," Margaret muttered. Pastor Jim fetched a bottle of formula and fed the baby while Claire wrote down details, where Margaret had found him, what time, any signs of who might have left him. When they asked if she had seen anyone, Margaret hesitated. She thought back to just before she found the box. She had seen someone, a tall man in a long, black coat walking quickly out of the alley. He didn't look homeless. His shoes had shone even in the dim light. For a moment their eyes had met. He had glanced at her, then at the box, and then he had turned away without a word. Margaret almost told them. But for some reason, she didn't. Something in her gut told her this wasn't over. Hours later, the baby was fed, warm, and sleeping in a small cot in the shelter's back room. Margaret sat beside him on a wooden chair, her tired eyes watching every tiny movement. Pastor Jim came in quietly. "You know, Margaret, social services will come in the morning. They'll take him into the system." Margaret's jaw tightened. She had seen too many kids get swallowed by the system. Too many bounced from home to home until they aged out, alone. "What's his name?" Jim asked. Margaret looked down at the sleeping boy. His little fingers were curled into fists, his mouth still, moving a little from the bottle he had just finished. "Ethan," she said finally. "Ethan Hayes. If he has no one else, then he has me." Jim studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. That night, Margaret didn't sleep. She just sat there, watching Ethan breathe. Every now and then she reached out to adjust the blanket or touch his tiny hand. She thought about the man in the coat again. She could still see his face, clean-shaven, expensive-looking. He could have picked up that box. He could have saved the child, but he hadn't. She didn't know who he was, but something told her that one day his shadow would cross their lives again, and when it did, she would remember. That night, as snow piled high outside the shelter, Margaret didn't know she had just begun a journey that would take her from freezing alleyways to the doorstep of one of the richest men in the country, 20 years later. And when that day came, the knock on the door wouldn't be for her, it would be for Ethan. If you haven't subscribed yet, I'd love you to join our community by hitting the subscribe button. Through our stories, we build hope and give future to children and women abused all over the world. Motivate us by subscribing to hitting the subscribe button and turning on your notification bell. Also, let us know in the comments where you are watching us from and how this story hit home for you. Ethan Hayes did not grow up in luxury, but he grew up loved. From the day Margaret carried him into the church shelter, she made him the center of her world. Life was not easy. They moved often, from small rented rooms to shared apartments with other struggling families. Margaret worked any job she could get, cleaning houses, washing dishes in diners, sorting cans at recycling centers, anything that put food on the table and kept Ethan in school. She never complained, even when her back ached so badly she could barely stand. Whenever Ethan asked why she worked so hard, she would smile and say, "Because you're worth it, and one day you're going to change the world." Ethan didn't have expensive toys or new clothes, but Margaret gave him something more valuable, her stories. At night, she told him about people who refused to give up no matter how hard life pushed them down. She told him about kindness, about loyalty, about how the richest people in the world were not the ones with money, but the ones who cared for others. Those lessons sank deep into his heart. In school, Ethan stood out. Not because he was the smartest, though he was bright, but because he worked harder than anyone else. He helped teachers clean the classroom after hours. He shoveled snow for neighbors in the winter, mowed lawns in the summer, and saved every dollar he earned. By the time he was 16, he was fixing broken phones and laptops for people in the neighborhood. He had no formal training, just curiosity and a determination to figure things out. Margaret often watched him work at the little kitchen table of their apartment, tiny screws scattered everywhere, his brow furrowed in concentration. "You've got something special, Ethan," she would say. "Don't waste it on small dreams. Build something big, and when you do, remember where you came from." Ethan would nod, not knowing then just how big his life would become. After high school, Ethan earned a full scholarship to a top university in New York. It was the first time he had ever lived away from Margaret, and though he called her every night, she felt the absence like an ache in her bones. In college, Ethan took his repair skills to another level. What started as fixing laptops for classmates turned into a small business. Then, with a friend's help, he developed a software tool that improved computer security for small businesses. Within a year, companies were paying him thousands for licenses. By graduation, his business had grown so fast that investors were offering him millions. Ethan didn't change much. He still wore simple clothes, still spoke politely to everyone from janitors to CEOs. But he worked tirelessly, building his company into one of the most successful tech firms in the country. By the time he was 30, Ethan Hayes was a billionaire. The media called him the people's billionaire because he refused to buy super yachts or private islands. Instead, he poured millions into charities, homeless shelters, free education programs, and adoption services. Every time a reporter asked what inspired his generosity, he said the same thing. "I owe everything to a woman who had nothing, but gave me everything. My mother, Margaret Hayes." Life for Margaret changed too, though not in the way most people might expect. Ethan bought her a comfortable house in a quiet neighborhood outside Chicago. It was warm, safe, and filled with books and plants. She refused to let him fill it with expensive furniture or flashy gadgets. "I lived without those things my whole life," she told him, "and I've been just fine. What I want is a home filled with love, not things." Ethan respected that, but he made sure she never had to worry about bills again. One autumn afternoon, Ethan was in his office reviewing plans for a new community center when his assistant walked in with an envelope. "This came for you, sir. No return address." Ethan opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was neat, almost too neat, like it had been written slowly and carefully. The message was short. "We know who your real parents are, and they want to meet you." Ethan froze. For years he had wondered about his birth parents. Margaret had told him the truth early on, that she had found him in a box as a newborn. She had always said she didn't know who left him there. He believed her. But now, holding that letter, a wave of questions crashed into his mind. Who were they? Why now? And what did they want? He read the sentence over and over. Something about it felt wrong. It didn't say they wanted to see him. It said they wanted to meet him, as if they were strangers, which he realized they were. Still, curiosity tugged at him. He thought of all the possibilities. Maybe they had changed. Maybe they regretted their decision. Maybe there was more to the story. When he showed Margaret the letter that evening, she went silent. She read it twice, then placed it on the table. "Ethan," she said softly, "sometimes the past comes back not because it wants to make peace, but because it smells something worth taking." Ethan frowned. "You think they want something from me?" "I think people who walk away from a child in the cold once might not come back for the right reasons," she said. There was something in her tone, something guarded, that made Ethan look at her closely. He wondered if she knew more than she had ever told him. 3 days later, the answer arrived in the form of a sleek black limousine pulling up to his gated driveway. Ethan watched from the window as the doors opened and a man and woman stepped out. They were both dressed like people who had once been rich but were trying to hide the fact that they weren't anymore. The man's suit was tailored but worn at the edges. The woman's coat was expensive but slightly out of style. Their faces were familiar, not because he had met them before, but because he had seen them in magazines and news articles about business elites in Chicago, Gregory and Linda Munroe. And they were walking up his path with the confident stride of people who believed they belonged there. Ethan stood in the grand entryway of his home, watching the figures approach through the tall glass doors. Outside, the sky was the pale grey of an early winter afternoon, the kind that promised snow by nightfall. The sleek black limousine gleamed in his driveway, its tinted windows reflecting the bare trees that lined the property. The man reached the door first and rang the bell with a firm, practiced press, as if he had rung the doorbells of important houses his whole life. The woman stood just behind him, clasping her hands together, eyes scanning the front of the house with a mixture of curiosity and calculation. Ethan opened the door himself. "Mr. Hayes?" the man asked, though his tone sounded more like a statement than a question. He was tall, with neatly combed silver hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to appraise Ethan like a commodity. His suit fit well, but the faint shine of wear along the cuffs and collar told Ethan it had been worn many times before. "Yes," Ethan said evenly. The man extended a hand. "Gregory Munroes, and this is my wife, Linda." Linda stepped forward, her smile soft but rehearsed, the kind of smile meant for social events. She wore a camel-colored coat that looked expensive but was a few seasons out of style. Her blonde hair was perfectly arranged, but there was tension in her jaw. Ethan didn't take Gregory's hand right away. "You're here because of the letter." "Yes," Gregory said without hesitation. "We thought it was time we met our son." The word son hit Ethan like a jolt. For a moment he just stared at them, searching their faces for any trace of recognition, any warmth that might make the word feel real. He didn't find it. He stepped aside. "Come in." They walked into the marble-floored foyer, looking around with the polite curiosity of strangers entering a museum. Ethan led them to the living room, a warm space with soft, leather chairs and a crackling fireplace. Margaret was in the kitchen, but he knew she could hear every word. They sat. Ethan remained standing for a moment, leaning against the mantel. "So," he said slowly, "why now?" Gregory didn't waste time. "We owe you an explanation. 20 years ago, Linda and we were young. We weren't married yet. Her father was a powerful man, very strict, and he had strong ideas about how his daughter's life should go. When he found out she was pregnant," Gregory glanced at Linda, "he gave her an ultimatum, either give up the baby or be cut off completely." Linda's voice was soft when she spoke. "I was scared, Ethan. My father, he could be cruel. I told myself that giving you up was the best choice, that you'd end up with a family who could care for you better than we could." Ethan listened, but his jaw tightened. "You left me in a box, in the snow." Linda's eyes filled with tears, but her voice trembled with defensiveness. "We didn't mean for it to be that way. We arranged for someone to take you to a hospital, but—" She stopped, her gaze flicking to Gregory. "Things didn't go as planned." Gregory shifted in his seat. "It was complicated. But the point is, we've followed your life from afar. We're proud of what you've accomplished." Ethan's voice was calm, but there was steel in it. "You knew where I was all these years, and you never came forward, not until now." Gregory gave a small, almost embarrassed laugh. "Well, life changes. Our circumstances aren't what they used to be. The family business suffered some setbacks. We thought, maybe this was the right time to reconnect." Ethan stared at him. "Reconnect?" "Yes," Gregory said. "You're our son. We're your parents. Families help each other, don't they?" The room felt colder. Ethan could hear Margaret's footsteps in the kitchen, slow and deliberate, like she was making sure to be within earshot. "What exactly are you asking for?" Ethan said flatly. Linda leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly. "We're not asking for much, just some support while we rebuild. A loan, maybe. You'd be helping your own flesh and blood." The phrase flesh and blood made Ethan's stomach turn. He thought of Margaret working double shifts so he could have a new pair of shoes for school. He thought of her sitting at the kitchen table every night, listening to his dreams, encouraging him to go further. That was family. These two people sitting on his couch, were strangers. Margaret appeared in the doorway then, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her face was pale, but her eyes were sharp. "I remember you," she said quietly, looking at Gregory. Gregory's brows lifted. Excuse me? That night, Margaret said, her voice steady. 20 years ago, I was in the alley when I found Ethan. Just before I reached him, I saw a man in a black coat walking away. You looked right at me, then kept going. That was you. A flicker crossed Gregory's face. Surprise, then discomfort, then a quick mask of indifference. You must be mistaken. I'm not, Margaret said. I remember your face. I remember thinking how strange it was that a man dressed like you was walking alone in that neighborhood. I remember how you looked at the box and did nothing. Ethan turned to Gregory. Is it true? Gregory spread his hands. I don't recall the details. It was a long time ago. The important thing is we're here now. Ethan let out a slow breath. Number. The important thing is you left, and you stayed gone, and now you're here because you think I owe you something. Linda's eyes brimmed with tears again. We were young. We made a mistake. Doesn't that count for anything? Ethan shook his head. People make mistakes. But abandoning a baby isn't a mistake, it's a choice. And the fact that you can sit here now and talk about loans and rebuilding tells me exactly why you came. Gregory's jaw tightened. If that's how you feel, then I suppose there's nothing more to say. He stood, buttoning his coat. Linda lingered for a moment, her eyes searching Ethan's face as if hoping to find a crack in his resolve. She didn't. She rose and followed her husband to the door. As the limousine pulled away, Ethan stood in the doorway, his hands in his pockets. Snow had begun to fall, soft and slow. Margaret came to stand beside him. For a while, neither of them spoke. Finally, she said, You did the right thing. Ethan nodded. I know, but it still hurts. Margaret touched his arm. That's because you're human. But remember this, you are not defined by the people who left you. You're defined by the people who stayed. Ethan looked down at her, the woman who had saved his life, who had given him everything she could. You stayed, he said. I always will, Margaret replied. That night, Ethan sat in his study, staring at the flickering fireplace. He knew this wasn't the end of it. People like Gregory and Linda didn't just walk away quietly when they saw something they wanted. Somewhere deep inside, he felt the tension of a storm still gathering. And he was right. Ethan didn't hear from Gregory and Linda for 3 months. For a while, he thought maybe that was the end of it. Life slipped back into its rhythm. Board meetings, charity events, dinners with Margaret. But there was a tension deep inside him, like a faint hum in the background. One rainy afternoon in March, Ethan was at his downtown office when his assistant stepped in, looking uneasy. Sir, there are people in the lobby insisting on seeing you. They say it's urgent. Names? Ethan asked, though he already had a sinking feeling. Gregory and Linda Munroes. Ethan almost told her to send them away, but something in her voice made him pause. Let them in. When they entered his office, they looked different from the last time. Gregory's suit was still sharp, but his face was drawn, his eyes restless. Linda's makeup was lighter, her hair tied back. She carried a folder clutched tightly in her hands. Gregory spoke first. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't serious. Our situation has worsened. Ethan leaned back in his chair, watching them. And by situation, you mean money? Gregory didn't deny it. Yes, the business is gone. The house is in foreclosure. We've lost almost everything. But this... He gestured to the folder Linda was holding. This is why we came. Linda set the folder on the desk and slid it toward Ethan. Inside were old photographs, hospital records, birth certificates, even a few candid shots of a young Linda, pregnant. We wanted you to know we've always kept these, she said softly. No matter what happened, you were still ours. Ethan stared at the documents. Proof. proof that they were telling the truth about being his biological parents. He felt a strange mix of emotions, curiosity, sadness, and something like anger simmering beneath it all. "What do you want from me?" he asked. Gregory hesitated, then said, "Help. Enough for us to get back on our feet. We're not asking for a lifetime of support. Just a chance to rebuild." Ethan was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You had your chance to be in my life. 20 years of chances, and you left me in the snow. Do you know what that does to a person? To grow up wondering why you weren't worth keeping?" Linda's eyes glistened. "We were wrong. We know that now. But can't we at least try to start over?" Ethan's voice was calm, but it carried weight. "Start over? You don't start over after 2 decades of silence and expect the other person to pretend the first chapter didn't happen. You can't write yourself into my story now just because you like the ending." At that moment, Margaret appeared in the doorway. She had come with Ethan to the office for a lunch meeting and must have overheard from the hallway. She walked in slowly, her gaze steady on Gregory. "I kept quiet before," she said, "but maybe it's time Ethan hears everything." Gregory shifted uncomfortably. "Margaret." "No," she cut in, her voice sharp. "That night in the alley, you weren't just a man passing by. You were there because you put him there." Ethan turned sharply toward her. "What are you saying?" Margaret's voice softened, but her words were clear. "He didn't just see you in the box and walk away, Ethan. He left you there himself. I saw him put you down and walk off. That's why when he looked at me, there was no surprise, only guilt." Ethan's stomach dropped. "Is that true?" he asked Gregory. Gregory's jaw worked, but he didn't answer. Linda closed her eyes, her shoulders sagging. "It's true," she whispered. "We thought, if we left you somewhere someone might find you, it wouldn't be so bad, but we were wrong." Ethan stood slowly, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. The room felt heavy, the air thick with the weight of what had just been said. "You didn't just abandon me. You watched it happen. You made sure it happened." Gregory tried to recover. "We were desperate." "No," Ethan cut in. "You were selfish, and you still are." He moved around the desk until he was standing right in front of them. "Do you know what family is? It's not blood. It's not shared DNA. Family is the person who freezes beside you in the cold just so you don't freeze alone. Family is the one who sacrifices so you can have a chance. You're not my family. She is." He pointed toward Margaret, whose eyes were glistening but proud. Gregory's face hardened. "So that's it? You're turning your back on us?" Ethan's voice was like steel. "You turned your back on me first. This conversation is over." He called his assistant and told her to escort them out. Gregory muttered something under his breath as he left, but Ethan didn't care enough to listen. Linda paused at the door, her voice breaking. "I hope one day you can forgive us." Ethan didn't respond. When they were gone, the room felt lighter, but there was still a deep ache in his chest. Margaret stepped closer. "You okay?" He took a deep breath. "I am, because I know exactly who I am and who I'm not." That night, Ethan made a decision. He called his lawyers and arranged to launch a new foundation in Margaret's name, the Hayes Home for Abandoned Children and the Elderly. Its mission was simple. No child or senior would ever be left alone without care. At the grand opening months later, Ethan stood on stage beside Margaret, who was wearing a new dress she had reluctantly agreed to let him buy. The audience was filled with reporters, donors, and people whose lives had been touched by Ethan's work. When it was his turn to speak, he told the story. Not all of it, but enough. He spoke about being abandoned, about being found, about the woman who had nothing but gave him everything. He ended with the words that had been burning in his heart since that day in the office. "Blood may make you related, but loyalty makes you family, and sometimes the people who save you aren't the ones you were born to, they're the ones who choose to stay." The audience rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, some wiping away tears. Margaret stood beside him, smiling through her own. Somewhere far away, Gregory and Linda might have been watching. Maybe they felt regret, maybe not. But it didn't matter. Ethan had made his choice, and in his heart there was no doubt it was the right one.